Rachel and Daniel Thompson appeared to have an ideal marriage, the kind that people in their quiet suburban neighborhood admired. Their home, a beautiful two-story house with a neatly trimmed lawn, painted the picture of a happy family. Daniel was a hard-working businessman who had built a successful career in real estate, providing his wife and daughter with a comfortable life. Rachel, a former college teacher, had chosen to stay home after their daughter Emily was born, dedicating herself to raising their child and managing their household. To outsiders, their lives seemed perfect. Daniel was a devoted husband who never missed an anniversary or birthday, and Rachel was the doting wife who always made sure the house was immaculate and warm meals were on the table. Neighbors often saw them smiling at church on Sundays or taking evening strolls with their little girl. But behind closed doors, the reality was far from perfect. Daniel's job demanded frequent travel, sometimes keeping him away from home for weeks at a time. What had once been a passionate marriage slowly became strained by distance. Rachel found herself feeling more like a single mother than a wife, shouldering the responsibilities of raising Emily alone. The late-night calls and occasional flowers Daniel sent did little to fill the growing void in their relationship. Conversations between them became routine, revolving only around bills, Emily's school, or Daniel's work. The spark that had once kept their love alive was now barely a flicker. Loneliness crept into Rachel's life in ways she never expected. She had once dreamed of a life filled with love and companionship, but instead she found herself yearning for something more, something she couldn't quite define. Her days blurred into one another, and the nights felt unbearably long. It was during this time that Richard Thompson, Daniel's father, began visiting more frequently. Richard was a man of charm and confidence, carrying himself with an air of authority that made him captivating. A retired entrepreneur, he had spent his life building businesses, making connections, and enjoying the pleasures of wealth. Unlike his son, Richard had an easygoing nature, one that made conversations effortless. Whenever he visited, he would bring small gifts for Emily and spend time chatting with Rachel over coffee. At first, Rachel saw nothing wrong with their growing bond. Richard was family after all. He offered advice when she needed it, provided comfort when she felt overwhelmed, and made her laugh at times when she felt like she was drowning in silence. He understood her frustrations, her loneliness, and the exhaustion of raising a child alone. It felt harmless, at least in the beginning. But soon Rachel found herself looking forward to his visits a little too much. Her heart would race when she heard his voice, and she caught herself smiling at his text messages long after reading them. She ignored the warning signs, convincing herself that it was merely friendship. She never imagined that this connection would spiral into something dark, something that would ultimately lead to betrayal, destruction, and death. Rachel's relationship with Richard deepened in ways she hadn't anticipated. What started as harmless companionship soon became something far more dangerous. She knew the line between appropriate and forbidden, yet she kept inching closer to it, convincing herself that there was no harm in enjoying the attention. Richard made her feel special, something Daniel hadn't done in a long time. His compliments were subtle, yet intoxicating. He noticed the small things, her new hairstyle, the perfume she wore, the way she laughed when she was truly happy. Their meetings became more frequent, no longer just casual visits. Richard found excuses to drop by when Daniel was away, offering to help around the house or take Emily to the park, so Rachel could have a break. He made himself indispensable, a comforting presence in her otherwise lonely life. And Rachel, despite knowing better, allowed it to happen. She told herself it was harmless, that she was simply grateful for his kindness, but deep down she knew the truth. It wasn't long before innocent conversations turned into something more. Their words carried an underlying tension, an unspoken desire neither dared to acknowledge outright. Richard was patient, careful not to push too hard, but he didn't need to. Rachel was already falling into the trap willingly. She began dressing up a little more on the days he visited, choosing outfits that flattered her figure. She started, lingering in conversations longer than necessary, holding his gaze just a second too long. The boundaries between them blurred, and with each passing day, the weight of guilt felt lighter. The first time they crossed the line, it happened almost naturally, as if it had been inevitable. A simple touch, a brush of fingers as he handed her a cup of coffee, lingered longer than it should have. A look that lasted just a moment too long. And then a stolen kiss, hesitant at first, but quickly turning into something neither could deny. Rachel didn't resist. If anything, she had been waiting for it. The warmth of his touch, the way he made her feel desired, was something she hadn't felt in years. Their affair escalated quickly after that. Every moment alone became an opportunity. They met in secret, hiding their relationship in the shadows of deception. Hotels, empty parking lots, and even the very home Rachel shared with Daniel became places where their forbidden passion thrived. It was reckless, dangerous, and entirely unstoppable. The risk of getting caught only added to the thrill. But not everyone was blind to their actions. Daniel's younger brother, James, had begun noticing things that didn't add up. The way Richard and Rachel interacted seemed too comfortable, too familiar. He noticed the stolen glances, the subtle tension in the air whenever they were in the same room. At first he dismissed it as his imagination, but the more he observed, the more certain he became. Something was happening between them, and James was determined to find out the truth. Rachel and Richard, lost in their web of passion, had no idea that their secret was no longer as hidden as they believed. And soon, the consequences of their betrayal would come crashing down, bringing destruction in ways they never saw coming. James had always been observant, the kind of person who noticed things others overlooked. At first, his suspicions about Rachel and Richard seemed absurd, but as time went on, the signs became impossible to ignore. The way Rachel's demeanor changed whenever Richard was around, the lingering glances, the way Richard found excuses to be near her, it all felt wrong. James didn't want to believe it, but a gut feeling told him something wasn't right. Determined to uncover the truth, he started paying closer attention. He noticed how Rachel's phone was always within her reach, how she smiled at messages she never mentioned to Daniel. He observed how Richard, once a distant and somewhat reserved man, suddenly seemed more invested in Rachel's life than ever before. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but James needed proof. One evening, while Daniel was away on a business trip, James decided to follow Rachel. She had told the family she was meeting a friend for dinner, but something about the way she left the house seemed off. James waited a few minutes before getting into his car and driving after her, keeping his distance so she wouldn't notice. He watched as she pulled into a hotel parking lot on the outskirts of town. His heart pounded as he saw Richard step out of his car and walk toward her. They didn't just meet like two people having an innocent conversation. There was an intimacy in their movements, a familiarity that made James sick to his stomach. He parked his car a safe distance away and watched as they entered the hotel together. His suspicions had been confirmed. He didn't want to believe it, but there was no denying what he had just witnessed. James sat in his car for what felt like an eternity, debating his next move. Should he tell Daniel? Confront Rachel and Richard himself? The betrayal ran deeper than he had imagined. This wasn't just an affair. It was a violation of everything their family stood for. Richard wasn't just anyone. He was Daniel's father. The weight of that reality made James's blood boil. Unable to contain his anger, he decided to confront Rachel the next day. He waited until Daniel had left for work and then showed up at the house, demanding answers. Rachel's face drained of color the moment she saw him. She didn't even try to deny it. Instead, she broke down, begging him not to say anything. She pleaded with him, saying it was a mistake, that it had gone too far, but she couldn't stop. She even offered him money, anything to keep him silent. But James wasn't interested in lies or bribes. He told her he wasn't the one she needed to be afraid of. Daniel would find out, and when he did, there would be no coming back from it. That night, James sat across from Daniel at the dinner table, struggling to find the right words. He knew what he was about to say would destroy his brother's world, but he had no choice. Taking a deep breath, he finally spoke. And in that moment, everything changed. Daniel sat in stunned silence as James laid out the truth before him. His mind refused to process the words, but the evidence was undeniable. His father, the man he had respected his entire life, had been sleeping with his wife. The woman he had vowed to love and cherish had betrayed him in the worst possible way. It wasn't just infidelity. It was a violation of trust so deep that it shattered everything he believed about his marriage, his family, and his own judgment. Anger surged through him like wildfire, his hands trembling as he gripped the edge of the table. James watched cautiously, unsure of how Daniel would react. At first, there was only silence. Then, without warning, Daniel slammed his fist against the wooden surface, sending plates and glasses clattering to the floor. His breathing was ragged, his vision blurred with rage. He had been made a fool, right under his own roof. Daniel didn't waste any time. He stormed out of the house, driving recklessly through the night until he reached his father's estate. When Richard opened the door, he barely had time to react, before Daniel shoved him back inside, slamming the door behind him. The confrontation was brutal, filled with accusations, curses, and years of unspoken resentment boiling over. But Richard didn't deny it. He didn't even apologize. Instead, he smirked, as if amused by his son's fury. Daniel had expected guilt, shame, maybe even regret, but instead he was met with arrogance. Richard taunted him, telling him that Rachel had chosen him over Daniel, that she had craved something his son could never give her. The words sliced through Daniel like a blade, his fury teetering on the edge of something uncontrollable. But, as much as he wanted to destroy his father in that moment, he knew it wouldn't change anything. Instead, he turned his rage toward the woman who had vowed to be faithful to him, Rachel. He didn't go home that night. Instead, he drove aimlessly, his mind spiraling into dark thoughts. Divorce was the obvious choice, but it wasn't enough. He wanted her to feel the same pain, the same humiliation. He wanted her to suffer. The idea formed slowly, twisted and poisonous, but once it took root, It refused to leave. Over the next few days, Daniel became eerily calm. He no longer confronted Rachel, no longer questioned her whereabouts. Instead, he began watching, waiting, planning. He tracked her movements, took note of her routines, and carefully laid the foundation for what was to come. He sent an anonymous message to her phone, pretending to be someone who had discovered her affair. The message instructed her to meet at an abandoned cabin outside town if she wanted to keep her secret safe. Rachel panicked. She believed it was James. Terrified that he had gathered more proof and was planning to expose her, she followed the instructions without hesitation. She didn't tell Richard. She didn't tell anyone. She drove out to the secluded location alone, never once suspecting that she was walking straight into a trap. She never returned home. Rachel arrived at the abandoned cabin just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the desolate landscape. The air was heavy with the scent of damp wood and decay, and an eerie silence surrounded her. She gripped her phone tightly, her heart pounding as she stepped out of the car. She had tried calling the unknown number that had messaged her, but there was no answer. Whoever had sent the threat wanted her to come alone. Fear gnawed at her, but she had no choice. If James had evidence of her affair with Richard, it would ruin everything. Daniel would leave her, take Emily away, and she would be left with nothing. She needed to get ahead of this, to find out who knew and what they wanted. She pushed open the creaking cabin door and stepped inside. The room was dark, except for a single candle flickering in the center. The shadows danced against the rotting walls, creating the illusion of movement. She took a hesitant step forward. "Hello?" she called out, her voice barely above a whisper. Silence. Then suddenly the door slammed shut behind her. She spun around, her breath hitching in her throat. A figure emerged from the darkness, stepping into the dim candlelight. Her heart stopped. It was Daniel. But he didn't look like the man she had married. His expression was void of emotion, his eyes cold and unreadable. He didn't speak, didn't move. He just stared at her, and for the first time, Rachel felt true terror. She opened her mouth to explain, to beg, but before she could utter a word, Daniel lunged. She screamed as he grabbed her by the throat, slamming her against the wooden wall. Her head cracked against the surface, sending a wave of dizziness through her. She clawed at his hands, gasping for air, but his grip was unrelenting. "You thought I wouldn't find out?" he hissed, his voice low and dangerous. "You thought you could humiliate me, betray me, and just walk away?" Tears streamed down Rachel's face as she tried to shake her head, tried to plead for mercy. But Daniel had none left to give. With a sudden violent force, he threw her to the ground. She coughed, choking on air as she scrambled to her feet, but there was nowhere to run. Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out a small vial. Rachel's eyes widened in horror as he uncapped it and poured its contents onto a cloth. The sickly sweet scent filled the air. Chloroform. She barely had time to scream before he pressed the cloth over her nose and mouth. Her body thrashed, her limbs flailing as she tried to fight him off. But within moments, her strength faded and darkness swallowed her whole. When she woke up, she was tied to a chair, her arms bound tightly behind her back. The room was different now, colder, darker. She blinked rapidly, trying to clear her blurred vision. Then she saw him. Daniel stood before her, holding a knife. His expression was calm, almost peaceful. "This is the only way," he murmured. Rachel's screams were swallowed by the night. By the time her body was discovered, dumped miles away in a shallow grave, Daniel was already gone. No one knew where he had vanished. Some believed he had fled the country. Others thought he had taken his own life. But Richard knew the truth. One morning, weeks later, he found a single envelope placed on his doorstep. Inside was a note. Took what mattered most to you. Just like you did to me. Now we're even. There was no signature. There didn't need to be. Richard sank onto the steps, his hands trembling as he stared at the words. Daniel was still out there, watching, waiting, and he would never forgive.